divorce wouldn't bother them and to just carry on in front of the kids. And I was not at all convinced that I was going to survive the divorce, so I was really glad to know that my kids were going to be just fine. And I set out to find support, direction, benchmarks on how to become divorced and how to become a single parent. And when I think back now, I remember looking up the word single parent wasn't even in the dictionary then. So it was really an amazing time to go through a divorce. But I put myself in situations to begin to grapple with whatever was going on inside of me. First, you know, I had to get a job and I had to get a car and I had to get a place to live. And I had a whole lot of habits to do just for survival. But then I knew that my heart was breaking. So I found myself in the library, which is where you went to get books in the old days.
Oh, why?
Yeah, exactly.
And the only book that was available then was called On Death and Dying by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she had written it after researching men and women who were terminally ill and the stages that they went through to go from the time they heard it, that they were going to die, to up until the time that they died. And interestingly enough, for me, as I'm reading this book, I could relate to all the emotions and what these individuals were feeling. So at that point it dawned on me that I was grieving the death of the relationship with my husband. I was dealing with the death of my marriage, and I was also dealing with the death of a nuclear family. So I needed to figure out how to grieve because I had never had a significant loss in my life before that. So I went on a retreat for divorced adults. I joined a support group. I really started working on my insides while I was trying to get the outside living arrangements taken care of with my kids. And probably a year and a half or so after the divorce and after I was on this journey, I finally looked into my son's eyes. And you're not parents yet, but I'm sure your parents know by looking at you when you're really sad or upset. Parents have, it just shows. So I made us a big bowl of popcorn because I learned in my years of having little kids, if you really want to get them to talk, also for teenagers, put food in front of them because they'll want to talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I know what I'm doing.
but I did try, you know, I just took this really deep breath and went against everybody's advice and asked my sons how they felt about their mom and dad's divorce. Tom looked at his shoes, Tim looked out the window, Mike shrugged his shoulders. I re-asked it 2 or 3 times. They weren't going to talk. So I decided to just really be vulnerable with them and ask them, tell them how I was feeling. I was the first family member to ever get a divorce. Didn't know how my family was going to respond to me. Jim and I were the first couple in our group of friends to get a divorce. I didn't know how they were going to respond, and as I opened up and shared, my sons began to share. And we sat there for over 3 hours. We talked together, we yelled, we cried, and we started over to rebuild our family. And at the end, Tim, my youngest, who maybe was 6, said to me, "Mommy, you're different since you did that thing." Well, that thing was a retreat, but he wouldn't have known that. And I said, "Well, how am I different?" And he said, "Well, you're laughing again, and the phone is ringing, and the drapes are open. Can we do that?" And before I even had a chance to think it through, he said, "That's okay, we're the only divorced kids in the world anyway." Well, I knew that wasn't true. Certainly, there were less then than they are today, but nonetheless, they weren't the only ones. And I went then in search for a place for my kids like I was experiencing. And in those days, yeah, I went to the Yellow Pages. I'm not even sure you know what Yellow Pages are, but it's a big phone book, and it was yellow. And there was nothing available for kids. Had there been a death or a divorce, it was almost as if society expected the kids to just adjust, just carry on, go to school, don't cause trouble, you know, join the sport teams. But in the meantime, your whole life has been dismantled in one way or another. So I took the kids to counseling. The counselor said we didn't need counseling. He said, "You're just going through a divorce." I did ask him if he could teach me a skill set, which of course he didn't have. But then I went back to the organizations that I was a part of as a divorced adult. And they all told me again and again, "Kids are resilient, don't worry about them, you get strong, they'll be fine." But I knew my own sons were hurting because they told me that. So my kids were pretty normal kids. Matter of fact, they grew up in Des Moines, by the way, not too far from here. So they were pretty normal kids. They weren't getting into any more trouble than normal boys would be getting into anyway. They weren't fighting any more than brothers would fight. But I knew in their hearts that they were hurting because they told me. So I'm a pretty persistent person, and I kept going back to this organization saying I wanted them to create a retreat for kids who are living in single-parent families. And I never do give up when I know kids are hurting, and finally I'm certain to shut me up and send me away. The director said, fine, you create it and we'll do it. And I have this model that's over my head that I live by, which is, well, how difficult can that be, and set out to create a retreat, using my poor sons as my case studies of what they needed and wanted to talk about. So I gathered some other adults together that I knew and taught them how to be loving listeners, how to really listen to another person. It wasn't counseling, it's not therapy, it's really providing an opportunity, in this case for kids, to share their feelings and learn how to grapple with it so they can thrive through adversity. And the very first weekend, we had 35 kids. I watched them come in the door, their heads were down, their shoulders were slumped, they weren't holding the hands of their moms or dads, whoever was bringing them. And the weekend began, and initially they wouldn't talk, but I had created some activities and we fed them. And I had 6 different times that they would gather in small groups on topics, feelings, their story, what happened, anger, worry, family. And by Sunday, it was a miracle of transformation to see how these kids had changed. Some of them cried the entire time, some of them never cried. But what they did was find others that were going on that same journey with them. They didn't feel alone. They could find their similarities and the differences between somebody else's story of loss. And they had a chance to realize that they were on a journey and they wouldn't always feel this terrible. And we did those retreats for 3 years. I held 800 kids from 6 to 18. We did 2 age groups. We did the 6 to 13-year-olds and the 14 to 18-year-olds. And it forever changed my life in more ways than one. But every 3 months we'd have a reunion with the kids and we'd ask them, I would ask them, I said, how's life for you since you were here? And they would say, you know, Dad died and I didn't know if Mom would die while I was gone. If you're 8 years old, how would you know, right? Or, you know, Dad abandoned us. I didn't know if Mom would pick us up on Sunday. So I realized these kids have already gone through so much loss and are in fear and worry. Why are we not taking this program to where they are naturally? Where are they naturally? They're in schools. So I went to 3 schools where I knew the principals with this vision of having grief support groups right there at the schools. It would be free to the kids, and teachers would volunteer. And when I think back now, how difficult can this be? I did not have a charity. I did not have a business card. I did not have a logo. Teachers didn't volunteer in schools then. There were no clinicians in schools, and everybody got paid for what they did. But all 3 principals said, absolutely, these are the kids that are struggling academically, they're causing trouble on the playground. You create it, we'll implement it. What do you need from me? I did not think I was going to write it because I'm a nurse by background. Writing is not my forte. But again, somebody had to be the voice to these kids who were really, really hurting. When 800 kids can pretty much tell the same story about how they're feeling, how they're grappling, and how they're going through themselves, then you know that you don't need research. You've got the kids to have told you.